So we're in politics because we think Britain can be an amazing country again. That is why we're here. We're not here for managed decline. And most politicians I meet in Westminster, whether they admit it or not, the whole frame is managed decline. Pump the patient with as much morphine as is necessary to make it as comfortable as it can while it fades into utter irrelevance, and maybe even worse than that, right? We think something much better is possible. It's a time-limited mission. I think that we have to win a majority in 2029, which is why we're working as hard as we are, why Nigel's, come out of retirement to do this.
Right. Morning, Zia. How you doing?
Good morning. Very well. How are you?
Good. Well, a lot happier hearing Reform having a digital assets bill, the industry I've been involved in for the last decade now, being treated seriously by a UK party, and we will come to that. But the momentum for Reform at the moment is pretty insane.
Yeah, it's unprecedented. If we look at where we were about a year ago, we're not far off a precise 1 year anniversary from when Nigel held a press conference, billed as an emergency announcement with the siren emoji on Twitter. I still remember it. And he said he was going to come back. He was going to lead Reform UK. He announced his candidacy to be the next MP for Clacton-on-Sea. And I still remember actually the betting odds, because I just looked to see where things were. At the end of that day, they priced Nigel being the next MP in Clacton at about 32%. Today, the probability that the betting markets place on him being the next Prime Minister are higher than that. And that's happened in a year. And I don't think there's any precedent for that in British history. If we look at the election results on the 1st of May, we won 677 seats. We have north of 700 councillors now. A year ago, we had 9. And we won 42% of the seats on the 1st of May. We only stood in 12% of the seats a year ago. And look, we live in a world in which things that are very small and nascent, but with people who are very passionate and believe in what they're doing, can become very big very, very quickly. And because my previous life, I was a tech entrepreneur, I'm quite acutely aware of that in a way that, frankly, most politicians and candidly political journalists, as good as they are not necessarily aware of. Look at ChatGPT. Mm-hmm. ChatGPT got to 100 million users in a matter of months. It took Spotify, which everybody listening to this show probably has on their phone and maybe a subscription to, took 12 years to get to that number. So we're living in these exponential times. And, Nigel, one of the interesting things from tech is it's all about, the founder, right? These inspirational, mission-driven founders who can create enormous value and change the world. You can talk about Steve Jobs talking about leaving a dent on the universe, in fact. And then you look at Elon, obviously, with all the companies he has founded, and you look at Jensen Huang, NVIDIA, and you look at Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg. Nigel is the ultimate founder in politics. And it was a big reason why I decided to get into politics about a year ago, because I could see the country trending in a extremely worrying direction, right? And in Nigel, I've always been reasonably good at spotting inflection points in trends. I love taking on big challenges. I've no interest in impossible tasks, but I love very challenging, tall orders, carrying a big burden on my shoulders. And when Nigel said he was coming back, having done the will he, won't he thing a bit, I thought, that there's something very special that's potentially on the cards here. And one of the things that you will note, I would say, about Reform, its supporters, its members, its volunteers, and people who vote for us, is that they're probably the most clear-eyed people about how bad the situation in the country is. They see it very clearly, but they're also unbelievably optimistic. And the only reason I'm in politics is because, and the same reason for Nigel, pretty much everybody in the leadership team at Reform and our MPs, is because we actually think the UK can once again be a really formidable, prosperous, powerful country again. And if we didn't believe that, we wouldn't be doing it.
Well, I think all of us who are approaching this and approaching Reform and looking at your policy ideas hope the same. At the same time, we are in a pretty bad situation. Is it essentially a systems design problem? Is that the problem with government? Is it a systems design issue?
Yes, no doubt. Absolutely no doubt. And that's why, and you see this in so many parts of policy. So let's take, for example, the constant demand that you hear from UK pension managers saying, oh, we've got to compel pension money into UK companies. And I get why they want to do that, right? But it's addressing a symptom. Why is it that UK companies, why is the FTSE 100 so massively underperformed American stock markets? And I know there's a big natural resources element and stuff, but we all know that our best people are leaving the country, right? Whether it's the founder of Revolut or the founder of Checkout.com, people who are such enormous value creators have created tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of jobs, in reality. Why are they so keen to leave? One reason is because of the mad increase in capital gains tax, right, from Rachel Reeves. They're going to increase capital gains. And capital gains is a really interesting one because it's a great example of a power law tax, right? The capital gains tax receipts for the Treasury are not driven by somebody with £1,500 in Hargreaves Lansdowne account. They're driven by entrepreneurs who have billions in gains, where they might well be willing to pay, as they have done for decades, 20%. But you can push them beyond the edge, at which point that siren call of Monaco or Dubai or Singapore, and that might not be something that's has huge political currency, but it is actually vitally important if we want to pay for it. My mum's a nurse. She's 70 and she's only ever done NHS work. Same with my dad. My dad's a paediatrician in his 70s, only ever done NHS work as a matter of principle. And someone's got to pay for that health service. And the people with the broader shoulders should pay for that. We should be making them feel welcome in this country. And instead, we're making them flee, not just through the punitive tax policies, but through the rhetoric. And we should remember, it wasn't actually Labour who started this trend. It was a Tory chancellor who started talking about unearned income and all of this stuff. And anyone who understands entrepreneurship, anyone who started their own business, anyone who's invested in a business understands risk. You're an entrepreneur. You're a formidable entrepreneur. You know the demands that it has on your life. You know all of these insane rules around if you want to hire a contractor and all of these rules that they put in place. And invariably, it's because we have politicians who have no concept of any of this stuff. And also, I'll tell you also, you talk about systems design. It's also an incentives problem. So I used to have in my company, I used to have in our office up on the wall, a quote from Charlie Munger, who was Warren Buffett's business partner, who sadly passed away not long ago. I thoroughly recommend people go listen to his stuff. He's not obviously the most entrepreneurial person per se, but he was an incredibly wise person and very successful. And he had this quote, which was, show me the incentives, I'll show you the outcomes.
Yep.
Which speaks to that systems problem. And if you look at the incentives, since I've come into politics a year ago, I, in some ways, judge politicians per se less because I can see that everybody in the system is just ruthlessly power maximizing for themselves over the next 48 hours.
Yeah.
Right? And,
yeah.
Right. And by the way, should you not be doing that in the old parties? It's so maladaptive that you're just totally screwed and you get eliminated. And there are some examples of that. And so that's why I always believed, Nigel believed, that the only way we were going to be able to reboot and turbocharge the system, truly change the system incentives, was from without the system, i.e. a startup, an insurgent movement like reform. And one of the things people listening to this, look, whether you agree with what I'm saying or not, I'm sincere in what I'm saying. I'll tell you what I think. So will Nigel, so will Richard Tice, so will Lee Anderson, so will all of the people in reform, because we're all actually, in some ways, quite reluctant politicians, frankly, in the sense that we could all be doing other things. There's a lot of people in Westminster who their job as an MP is the highest paying job they would ever get. And one piece of evidence for that is how many people got turfed out in the election last year who have not actually secured decent jobs. And what I would say is that we need a total reshaping of the British economy. We need a total change in the incentives inside Westminster. And by the way, I was talking about Nigel being the Prime Minister in 2029 before the last general election. And a lot of people laughed, as you'd expect. Even inside the party, which was a very nascent party at the time, there was skepticism, understandably. But as I said, I've always been quite acutely aware of how quickly things that are quite small can become very big. And also you look at, we're now, as we speak, the YouGov poll from last week, and that's the gold standard poll, puts us 8 points clear of the government. A lot of polls put us polling at twice at where the Tories are. And look, we take nothing for granted. And sadly, we are years away from the next general election. But it was always my view that there was so much pent-up frustration in this country from people who love the country, who have just seen politicians who not only fail to do the things that they promised, but literally do the opposite. The Tories said that let's take immigration, right? Which is not, I'm not saying that if you solve immigration, every problem in the country is solved, but it is a massive problem upon which so many other problems, housing, crime in terms of prison spaces, or education in terms of school places, it's a derivative. Those are derivatives of the immigration problem. The Tories said in 4 consecutive manifestos they were going to take net migration down to the tens of thousands and left office with that number 1 million. I mean, that's not, you would struggle if you tried to deliver such a catastrophic betrayal. So look, we take very seriously now the business of government. We're now in control of 10 local councils. We've got some exciting announcements this week, including tomorrow. We're going to bring really formidable people, human capital, to these systems problems that you're talking about. And we're also going to be super transparent with the British people and constituents about what we're finding in terms of waste and potentially corruption. And then when Nigel wins, when Reform wins in 2029 and Nigel's the Prime Minister, flanked by, I think we need 350 to 400 Reform turquoise-blooded MPs who are just going to be in no uncertain terms as to why they're elected. I think Nigel's first term as Prime Minister will be looked back on by historians as the most transformative first term of a Prime Minister in British history. Orders of magnitude more transformative even than Margaret Thatcher.
So you mentioned there's incentives issues. And when we spoke previously, you mentioned Thomas Jefferson to me. I've been studying a lot of US history. I must have read the Declaration of Independence at least 10 times in the last few weeks. I've been reading the Federalist Papers, George Washington's exit letter. And one of the interesting things, when you read the Declaration of Independence and you look at their grievances with the king, they map quite well against the grievances the electorate have now with the institution of government.
Yeah.
So in some ways, I don't just see this next election as just a vote for a change of administration. I see it as a vote for a change in the institution of government. It feels a little bit revolutionary, but without muskets and such, it's more of a peaceful revolution. How much do you as a party think constitutionally, how the structure and institution of governments is to stop, post-reform, say, winning an election, we end up with the same trajectory?
Look, I think one big difference between America and the UK is the United States quite famously has a written constitution. And the founding fathers, I've spent a lot of time looking into this as well, because I'm very interested, but also because I've looked at, for example, what the Doge team under Elon have tried to do. And one of the reasons why, and I admire Elon enormously, obviously as an entrepreneur, I think he's the most consequential entrepreneur of all time by distance. But one of the challenges that he has come up against is the fact that the founding fathers were at pains to put the purse strings in terms of spending in the hands of Congress, not in the hands of the executive branch. And that's actually in contrast to the UK. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, assuming that he or she is flanked by a significant majority in the Houses of Parliament, is far more constitutionally empowered over UK spending. And I've done the morning media rounds today. There's obviously absolute incredulity from the mainstream media and politicians that there's any penny to be cut in terms of wasteful spending, even though the Telegraph revealed yesterday that there's £1 billion per month going in the form of benefits to foreigners in this country. I mean, how does that work when we're telling pensioners who have paid into the system their whole lives that there's no money for them for the winter fuel allowance anymore, or 13-year-old children in Wales, their educational attainment is below the OECD average. Just these things that everybody listening to this program, and by the way, so many people who work unbelievably hard, who set their alarm clocks in the morning, just are struggling. And you know what's crazy about this? This happens at, I spend a lot of time, Peter, in Runcorn.
Yep, you just want to see there.
Yeah, and knocking on doors and listening to people. And there are people whose household incomes are well below the median in this country, but they set their alarm clocks in the morning and they're proud people, and, their garden is just beautifully curated. And when you talk to them and they say, well, somebody on my road is just on benefits and they don't work, and frankly, those people seem to have a much better life than they do. There's something seriously wrong when that social contract starts to fray. And I think not only is it fraying, Peter, I think it's hanging by a thread. And that's a lot of what we are speaking to in terms of reform. Going back to your question, though, in terms of the difference between the US and the UK and what we're trying to do here, look, Tony Blair instituted enormous changes to the UK constitutional makeup, even though we don't have a written constitution, obviously devolution and all of this stuff, and really triggered the march through our institutions of what I would call the far left. And I think the whole left-right thing is in many ways antiquated, but I do think there is this element of, modern neo-Marxism, cultural Marxism that has sort of taken hold, which is why, for example, our military lost an employment tribunal discriminating against white people. I mean, how on earth these things are possible inside a country? And the notion that the notion that can just keep happening, or the fact that, when you talk to people, in Runcorn, and you have huge influxes, basically an unholy alliance of Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, and Serco just depositing illegal migrants into houses of multiple occupancy, HMOs, inside communities, without any say at all from local communities. And what's almost Bond villain-esque in its villainy, people are being turfed out with Section 21 notices, including, and I've got confirmation of this, veterans who are suffering from PTSD being turfed out to accommodate people whose first act upon coming to this country was to break our laws. I mean, that is the sum of all fears in terms of unfairness and just a diabolical way to treat your citizens. And so how people are surprised that reform has had the success that it has, I don't know. I think America is different to the UK. I have spent a lot of time in America. I sold my company to an American bank, and the US was the majority of our revenues of the company that I co-founded. It is different, but there are similarities. I don't think there's any chance the UK is going to be that up for concealed carry or anything like that. Yeah. Or who knows if London keeps going the way it is, right? But the reality is that there are people in this country there's a real sense of a desire for fairness, Peter. People in this country are just sick and tired of being taken for mugs. And, I just did, like I said, I did the morning media rounds, and the people saying, oh, where are you going to find £60 billion to pay in the national budget to pay for the tax cut we want to give people, so that people, the threshold at which point you start paying income tax is at £20,000. And I said, you do realise, how many of you asked Labour that question, given that in their manifesto in June last year, they said they were going to raise spending by 10 billion. And 3 months later in their first budget, they raised spending by how much? 60 billion. Exactly the amount that would have been needed to give people listening to this program whose net pay would have increased 5 to 10% as a result of that. So whenever it comes to foreign citizens, infinite money tree, right? Chagos Islands, give away sovereign territory and pay for the privilege of doing so. Asylum hotels, HMOs, 5 billion a year and growing. When it comes to British people, there's no money left. You've got to soak people listening to entrepreneurs. We've got to soak people who are worried about transferring their business or their farm to their children. We're going to soak pensioners. We're going to soak people who are setting their alarm clocks in the morning, who are paid into the system their whole lives, done everything right. Those people's lives keep deteriorating. I want to say one more thing about this, because a lot of people listening to this and the people in this country feel like they're getting poorer. Every year, they just feel like they get poorer. They go and do their weekly shop. It gets more expensive. They open their energy bills. They're terrified to open their energy bills because it grows exponentially. The reason for that is that they are literally getting poorer. The real wages in this country there's been no growth in that now for north of 15 years compared to countries like America. I mean, GDP per capita in this country, which is really what matters, right? People do this obsession about GDP growth. People who are listening to this who are employed at a company, you don't really care about what the total payroll number is in your business, in the company you work for. You care about how much you earn, right? It's no consolation if good news and bad news. The The bad news is that your pay isn't increasing. The good news is the payroll for the whole company is up 7%. That's neither here nor there, right? And GDP per capita is what matters. And so as we start to formulate our economy, our economic policy, we'll be just ruthlessly optimizing we think we need to get GDP per capita growing between 3 and 5% a year to turbocharge this country.
Well, I saw something similar to that on Twitter. Some guy put out a question the other day, and I think I replied to him. I retweeted him. He said, for those of you who are going to be voting for reform, have you questioned how they will fund their policies, these underfunded policies? And my reply to him was, well, we're 3 trillion in debt here, and the debt is growing under the Labour government, and I think it grew nearly 2 trillion under the 14 years of Conservatives. How were their policies funded? Here we go. Before I answer this, please explain to me why the government is 3 trillion in debt and the costed policies that got us there. And so these people are questioning the costed policies of reform, but they haven't questioned them of, they probably did, these are probably Labour voters, but they're not questioning Rachel Reeves right now, where she is strangling the economy. And just to add into that, what I kind of resent is that, I work hard, I build businesses, all the incentives of owning a business are gone.
Yep.
Everything's been stripped away. Yeah, but I still take the risk. I still worry about payroll. When I do get paid, or when a company does make money, I pay my corporation tax. And when I do get paid, the things I buy, I pay tax on. If I choose to save some money and release some of that, I pay capital gains tax. And if I choose to leave anything to my children, they're going to pay 40% tax on stuff I've already paid tax on. There's this constant hand of the government into everything I try and do that they take from. And so there's a strip out of these incentives. And of the rich people I know, I've talked about it on the show, of all the rich people I know, they've either left or thinking about leaving or want to leave. And one guy said to me, he said, I don't mind paying tax, but I'm seeing it being pissed away. And crime is on the increase, and people are walking into shops and just stealing, and there's guys on electric bikes snatching people's phones. It's like, why am I here?
Well, I mean, you just described why reform has had the success that it has. And, it's really interesting because if you actually, let me put a few statistics into what you just described, right? So let's take London, where we are right now. Most people who walk around in London, they hold their smartphone like for dear life in the way you don't need to in a lot of other countries, including third world countries. Why? Because we have an epidemic of people riding around on e-bikes and mopeds, stealing mobile phones. Okay, let's look at the statistics behind that, because we're often told, well, that's just irrational fear. Do you know what percentage of smartphone thefts result in the suspect even being identified? Not arrested, not charged, not convicted, not incarcerated, just identified.
I'm assuming it's a rounding error on zero.
Sub 1%. So you have a 99%. So if you look at incentives, going back to the Charlie Munger quote, why would you not be stealing phones if you have a north of 99% chance of even being identified before you go and look at all of those other things?
Can I throw something in there?
Yeah.
So we have open drug dealing on the streets of Bedford. So we see it. We see the guys that turn up on their e-bikes, and there's an alleyway off the main high street, and they're selling drugs. And I was thinking, well, if I can see this, if the police know it's happening. I spoke to somebody who works at the Met, and he said to me, there's no point arresting these people, because once we arrest them, they claim they're victims of modern slavery. Yep. They have a visit from the Salvation Army, and then they're not prosecuted. And so these people know what's going to happen. So they know that essentially there's no penalty for drug dealing.
They're invincible. They feel invincible. Yeah. And that's what we have now. We have a country where, I tweeted out, I think yesterday, that we live in a country where we're told that deporting people here illegally is illegal. We're told that stopping people coming here illegally across the channel is illegal by our politicians and our judiciary. And I put much more blame on the politicians than the judiciary, and we'll come on to why. And then we're also told, and then you look at shoplifting, which is de facto legal. I mean, below £200, like definitely de facto legal, but no one cares. Drug dealing, all of these things, right? All of the things have such a massive, antisocial behavior, huge negative impact on quality of life of people who live in this country, are de facto legal now. Everything is upside down. But then, let's go back to the first question you asked me. Is it a systems problem, right? So you look at the Labour and the Tories when they were fighting amongst each other. And obviously the Tories are now polling fourth and are far less relevant. But
which is insane, by the way.
I don't know how insane it is, because they are. I think it's richly deserved for what they've devastated the country over the course of that. 14.
No, I agree, but it's just incredible to see that this. You talked about it earlier. The growth of things like Spotify and then ChatGPT.
Yeah.
Like, I get it, but it's still just wow.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And the Tories. Spotify would be far too complimentary to them. I said sort of 7 or 8 months ago, I was saying that when everybody was talking about a pact and we needed a merger, and obviously those calls have died down a lot now for pretty obvious reasons. But I said that Reform needed a merger with the Tory party in the same way that Netflix needed a merger with Blockbuster, right? And I was probably being unkind to Blockbuster in hindsight. But if we look at, let's take crime, right? Again, rather than just saying, oh, hey, let's come out with some quote for the next news cycle, there is nowhere near enough prison space in this country. So let's take a look at the 14-year record of the Conservative Party. When they were in government, they grew the population in this country by 6.5 million people on a net basis, almost entirely through immigration.
Was that about 8%?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And do you know how much? I think it was 6%, or so, somewhere between 6 and 8. And do you know how many prison places they built in that time?
Well, they didn't build any, did they?
411.
Oh, they did.
And the funny thing is, the only reason we know that is because Richard Holden, one of their own MPs, asked the question in Parliament. That's why we know the answer to that.
But that's a rounding error on 200,000 places.
Anyone who has actually looked at the literature on this, cross-culturally across the world, if you have a large population, there will be a small fraction, pretty persistent fraction, that is violently criminal, that sadly cannot be rehabilitated. Some people can. These people cannot. And if they are not in prison, they will commit violent crime and terrorize the population, the law-abiding citizens. So if you grow the population by 6.5 million people, and you basically build no prison capacity, Peter, we all know what the result is. And so we can have all the performative videos and shouting about it, but we need to build, and this is what we will do, we need to rapidly scale incarceration capacity to put violent criminals. I'm not saying everybody, I'm not saying that some people can't be rehabilitated. Obviously, some people can. But again, if you're being honest about this, which we are, and you actually care about the lives of law-abiding citizens, Elon actually said this in that press conference with Trump last week, which was a pretty surreal press conference, where he said, there's this constant empathy that is desired in popular, culture amongst politicians. The empathy is always towards the criminals and not to the people who are victims of that crime. And you have these crazy situations devastating situations where, for example, there was a man who was released from his prison sentence very early. He'd only served, I think, about a quarter or a third of his sentence, maybe even less, who was an accessory to murder with a machete of a 16-year-old boy. And I remember reading the account of the victim's mother. And it was one of the most devastating things I've ever read. I mean, think about how you'd feel about that. Your son is it's utterly devastating. And so that's the cost of having utter incompetence. When you talk about ruthlessly optimizing for your own power over the course of the next 48 hours, that is the sum total of the modality of the Tory party. They didn't care about any of this. And by the way, I've just talked about prison places. Okay, let's talk about health. All right. So,
can we stay on prison? We can go to health after this.
Yeah.
But we could create more places by putting the right people in prison. And I'm going to bring up the Lucy Connolly one, and not as a defender of Lucy Connolly. It's that I actually struggle with this one because I'm not a free speech absolutist.
Yeah.
But I think it should be a high bar on incitement to violence.
Yeah.
And I don't think the Lucy Connolly one, I'm not sure it was a high enough bar, and it should have been tested better. And I really struggle with that. And I think I heard Konstantin Kissin talk about 4,000 people have been investigated for their tweets, which, by the way, that's a lot of police resource spent on checking on tweets. But are we just imprisoning the wrong people? If we have a choice, like for like, my rational mind says if we need a prison place, we're probably better off releasing Lucy Connolly than we are a guy who a machete attacked a young lad, because I don't think she's going to make that mistake again. I don't think she's going to be a drain on the resource of society. we release a guy who's happy to go and attack a 16-year-old with a machete, I don't know if he's rehabilitated. Who would I rather have as a neighbour? Lucy Connolly? I could just disagree with her abhorrent tweets, but at the same time not be fearful living next door to her.
Yep.
Do I want to live next door to the machete guy? So are we imprisoning the wrong people for the wrong things?
Yeah. So yes, 100%. And that's why, again, people listening to your podcast know that they can hold more than one thought in their heads at the same time.
Yeah.
So yes, it's true. We have catastrophically too little prison places as a result of the insane immigration, open border policies, and total lack of regard for people's safety to build prison places. It's also true. I mean, you look at what Lucy Connolly tweeted. It was an appalling tweet, right? Absolutely appalling. But let's be clear about something. You compare her sentence to the sentence received by actually violent criminals who actually, with their own hands, committed devastating, life-changing crimes on people, night and day. Absolutely night and day. And again, if you look at the case law in the United States versus the UK, for example, the bar in the United States for incitement to violence is much higher, to your point. So you have to draw a clear line. The prosecutor has to successfully draw a clear line between what the word somebody said and an outcome that resulted in violence, right? And so, again, as you said, the tweet was appalling. Neither you nor I would should there potentially have been some criminal sanction for that? Potentially.
Community service?
But the idea that length of sentence is in any way commensurate, when I think it is true, and maybe we can check this, but I think it is actually true that the sentence that she has, should she serve the whole amount of it, is actually longer than that guy who was an accessory to murder with a machete. And just to be clear on that, he supplied the machete, right, as opposed to actually, just to be clear on that. But that's still, you talk about to what degree, what is the threshold, the burden of proof required to release somebody back into society if they have supplied a machete for the murder of a minor? I would argue it is an extremely high bar. And if I'm sure you've been to Dubai. When was the last time you were in Dubai?
I've only connected in Dubai. I've never actually been to Dubai.
People who have been to Dubai, they will tell you can walk around there. There's basically no crime, right? In the sense that people leave their cars in their ignition. As I said, people in this country have to hold on to their phones with dear life. And here's the other interesting thing: the thousands of people who are being investigated for their tweets by now what has become a surveillance state. We have, if you look at CCTV per capita in London, it's up there with China, right? There's very few countries. One of the, sadly, in terms of league tables now, the UK really only tops league tables that are the last ones you would want to top, right? CCTV per capita in London. You look at millionaires fleeing the country per capita, right? The reality is all of this is upside down. And that's why, as I said, I keep using the word reboot. We need like a hard reset of the way government is done. And that's only actually possible if you go from 5 MPs, I think, to north of 325. I think we need 350 to 400 to do this properly. And people who are coming to politics from outside of politics, right, who have a fresh perspective on this, who are only in politics in the first place to affect these sorts of changes.
The humble bee, a keystone species crucial to the survival of Earth's inhabitants. Here's how things would look if bees vanished. And here's how they'd look if humans vanished. But imagine if instead we became a keystone species by doing things the right way, by taking responsibility for our actions and becoming the solution. Iron mines the world's most responsible currency the right way. Because the future depends on it.
I mean, I've been to a few countries that are a lot safer than the UK, but tend to be autocratic regimes. How do you do that in a democracy? I think if you're a dictator and you can wield your power and threats, I think it's a lot easier. I think in Dubai, we know people have been arrested for what seem very minor crimes here in the UK. And we also know people have been there's a suspicion of torture, etc., etc. It's very difficult to speak against the state. There isn't a proper free press. So I see the Dubai scenario. I'm not interested in that place as a country. It's to me, it's a vapid kind of place. But I also see the challenges of democracies trying to maintain rule and order. So how do you marry those?
Well, look, number one, there's a reason why both me and you are still in this country,
here,
right? Because, it is absolutely, it is much easier to have a low crime country if it's an autocratic regime that clamps down on its citizens. I would remind everybody listening to this program as to what we all went through during COVID. Mm-hmm. Let's not forget that, right? I would argue that was pretty darned authoritarian, especially towards the latter stages. So, which should be an incredibly important warning sign as to where this country could head if we're not very, very careful indeed. Now, a lot of the things we're talking about are so catastrophically bad, Peter, that you don't need to, that for example, having enough prison space so that there's enough prison space to cater for the violently criminal community that cannot, or group of violent criminals that cannot be rehabilitated. It's not that hard. It's relatively straightforward, actually. Secondly, ensuring, I said that I put the blame, when you look at judges, how many times you read a story, almost every week, right? You read about a foreign citizen who's in our country, usually illegally, who has committed a heinous crime, rape, murder, and a judge has said you can't deport them because of the most almost comically ridiculous reason, to the point where you have to check it's not a parody that you're reading. It's not The Onion. It's actually real. Seriously, it's tragic. There's a Kenyan man who's raped multiple women and been convicted, but he cannot be deported back to Kenya because he's an alcoholic and he might have a tough time in Kenya as an alcoholic. Right? There's this sort of ridiculous sort of thing. Or there was the one about chicken nuggets, and I actually looked into this. This is actually true.
Well, I don't know.
It's actually true. There's a guy who said that he really liked chicken nuggets and he can't get that. I mean, the point is, because look, are there, I think, activist judges who are deeply unhelpful and are working against the interests of people? Probably. I don't think that's all judges, right? And you do have to have an independent judiciary, obviously. But I put this blame squarely in the court of politicians who get to legislate the laws. There should be no ability for a legal industrial complex to allow people in this country illegally to stay.
Hold on. An Albanian criminal's deportation was halted partly because his young son's aversion to foreign chicken nuggets. Clevis Disha, 39, entered the UK illegally as an unaccompanied minor. He later gave a fake name and falsely claimed to be born in the former Yugoslavia, blah, blah, blah.
An immigration tribunal ruled it would be, quote, unduly harsh for his son. So look...
hold on, you need to finish that. It's unduly harsh for his 10-year-old son, known as C in the court documents, to return to Albania with his father owing to food sensitivity, sensory issues, and difficulty communicating emotions. Is this ECHR?
I mean, it's a whole... We've done a lot of work on this. Yeah, number one is the ECHR, right? Which sounds great, but let's not forget, this is a lot of these treaties were put in place decades and decades ago. And look, a lot of people forget, yesterday we had north of 1,000 people cross the channel illegally, Peter. And I was just on a show where just before I went on, they said, we don't know how many of these are legitimate refugees. Sorry, they're coming from France. 17 million British people went on holiday to France last year. So wherever they originated from, they're not fleeing immediate danger, right, in the country of France.
Was this
I mean, I know there were some rough parts of Paris, but it's ridiculous to argue that in any way somebody coming from, if you just think about asylum generally, right, the notion that somebody should be coming from France to the UK to seek asylum from France is so ridiculous that it doesn't bear any scrutiny whatsoever. And we've got to have politicians that actually take this stuff seriously, Peter, and we haven't had that in decades.
Was that a mainstream media interview?
It was.
You must now, the number of interviews you've done, notice a distinct difference between the interviews you do in the mainstream media and something like this.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
Will you get rid of Ofcom?
Look, I think one of the interesting things is that... So number one, and I keep reiterating this, we take very seriously the business of government, so I'm not going to create policy in real time, right? But
I'm
what I
being
will say is, and maybe this is my personal view, I spent a career building stuff from scratch, as have you, right? And it's very difficult to build stuff, as you know. It's much easier to break stuff and destroy stuff. And I just think that if you look at institutions, I think trust in institutions is on its knees in this country, right? So whether it's Ofcom or the BBC, or particularly in the UK, ironically, and the BBC has a much better reputation internationally than it does in the UK, sadly. Whether it's our judiciary, and again, I stress we talked about this earlier, right? You've got to be very careful as you look to transform the country, that you're very precise in your surgery, right? And that you don't do things that might be pragmatic at the time. And we think very deeply about this reform, and Nigel thinks about it very deeply. How do we ensure that we have a country? The whole reason we're here is not just because we want a great country in the next 5 years. We want a great country in 100 years. And so if you're performing significant surgery to the country, which I think we need to do, you do have to be very precise. And institutions, to the degree it is possible for them to be transformed, I think we should try to do that. I think that, but they haven't helped themselves. I mean, do you remember during COVID, right? One of the, America was probably at the vanguard of just absolute destruction of trust in institutions. Do you remember the CDC during COVID? They came out and they said, masks don't work. Don't bother with masks. Pointless. I don't know if you remember that.
I do.
And then a few weeks later said, no, and probably less, maybe like 10 days or 2 weeks later, they said, no, actually masks are compulsory. And they were, hold on, you just told us that they didn't matter and you shouldn't bother with them. And they said, no, that's because people were hoarding N91 masks, which were, the more clinical ones. And we needed those for our clinicians. And so we basically lied because you public would be far too dumb and stupid to understand that, without understanding what implications there were. And then do you remember, I still remember this, I was looking at this open letter that was written by a whole phalanx of academics in STEM subjects mostly, from elite universities, not just in America, but the world, right? Princeton and Stanford and Harvard, and professors of biology and biochemistry and genetics, who basically wrote open letters saying the BLM marches were fine because so if white people were going and marching about anything, for example, against the lockdowns or whatever it might be, that was completely unconscionable and unacceptable. But if people were marching, going on protests on behalf of BLM, it was acceptable because, and I'm paraphrasing, you might be able to bring it up, but the problem of racism, systemic racism in America, was as big a problem as the pandemic. Or just something so ridiculous and two-tier that it was, again, I thought it was like an Onion story. I thought it was a parody. Tragically, it wasn't. And you can draw a straight line from that and what we're seeing now, which, as I said, is a total collapse in trust in institutions. And I do think we do need some institutions, right? I think if you don't have any institutions, frankly, you end up with anarchy. Let's take policing in this country, right? Where there's a lot of talk about two-tier policing. A lot of people do think there is two-tier policing. And, you take the way and the judiciary as well. Again, let's take that case we just talked about, right? A multi-year prison sentence. The appeal is rejected. She can't see her children. For, again, let's be really clear, right? An appalling tweet, right? Like, no one is defending the tweet at all. And yet people who have committed violent crime serve sentences, or even are given sentences far shorter. And so people can see this stuff. Reform's job is to not tear down institutions, although probably some will be beyond saving, I think, by 2029. What we want to do is try to restore confidence in institutions by being able to go in. And I think you have to, reform is uniquely positioned to do this because we don't have a track record of doing this stuff in the first place. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
We're the new kids on the block. We're the ones who can go in and go, yeah, look what we found. We do need a total change so that, look, of course, we're not going to try and turn the BBC into something that's just that's just propaganda for reform. But do you remember the general election last summer when Nigel went on Question Time? I still remember this. And every question during the Question Time debate for the general was every single question to Nigel was a personal insult of him, like literally an ad hominem personal insult of Nigel, and then the whole audience clapped like seals. There's nothing about that that's remotely acceptable. We've had situations. I was personally, I was fact checked live.
I watched your
and it turned out it wasn't a fact check. Like, I was correct. And think about the threshold that should actually be there to, because it's quite disconcerting, right? If you're on Question Time, you've got a pretty hostile audience anyway. Not always, but pretty hostile. Certainly not proportionate.
A few plants.
Yeah. But you remember then I said, well, how many people here voted for Reform? And like almost like I think 3 people put their hand up over an audience of about 70. And again, that was when we were polling at around 22%. So look.
It's not a sample.
It's not a sample, but I will also say this. The BBC brought us The Office, which is the greatest TV show of all time. The BBC brought us amazing entertainment and is actually an extraordinarily powerful institution internationally and an important part of British soft power. The problem is, with some notable exceptions, I'm not saying everybody in the newsroom at the BBC is a bad person, but I do think there's a significant amount of capture across most of these mainstream media organizations that are unwilling to look at a lot of these problems from first principles in the way that Reform does.
David Starkey issued me the same warning indirectly. He was here a few weeks ago, and I said at the end of it, can you recommend a couple of books to read? And he recommended I read Burke's Reflections on the French Revolution. I'll be honest, I couldn't fully understand the language. It would take a few reads per paragraph to try and get your head around it. So I ended up just getting essentially translated. And the argument that Burke was making is that, they were looking at the revolution in France, considering the UK, and saying you don't want to make too drastic changes, because if you do, then you don't know what the outcome. So he's reiterating exactly what you said. At the same time, the government seems to have become parasitic. It is huge. What is the right size of government?
Certainly smaller than it is now.
Yeah.
And, I was actually looking at this. I did some analysis of during the 14 years of Tory rule, they took state spending as a percentage of GDP to almost Soviet Union levels at one point. And they always come back and go, oh, COVID and all of that stuff. But let's be clear, there are other countries that didn't do that. And if you also look at, including in Europe, by the way, notably Sweden, and if you look at the way, and think about, do you remember the help out to eat out to help out thing? And then a week later, lock everybody else down? Make your mind up, right? I mean, billions of pounds squandered in that way. And then you'll also see, if you look at the British government under the Tories basically created a welfare system that appears to be as addictive as crack cocaine during COVID. That's what they did. And the evidence for that is in the data, where you see America and a lot of other countries, big increase in welfare spending during COVID, as you'd expect, right? Of course, there needed to be a policy response, but then it's normalized and pretty much gone back to where it was. The UK, notable exception on the world stage, sadly. When I said sadly, now these days, Britain seems to lead all the wrong league tables. And so we've got to change that. And so, again, one of the big messages you will hear from Reform in the coming years as we head into the general election is Reform is unapologetically on the side of people who set their alarm clocks in the morning. Whatever job you do, whether you're working in a hospital, you collect refuse, or you're an entrepreneur, whether you work in the city. Most of the problems I hear, people who work in the city on actually very well paid jobs, but they've got 3 children and their relationship with their partner is really breaking down because they can bet even on that. Don't get me wrong, they're very privileged in terms of how much money they make, but they're working 15-hour days, 6 days a week, both of them. They've got 3 children. They can barely afford childcare. Now, that problem set correlates almost perfectly with people I speak to in Runcorn and people we speak to in Wales who are working really, really hard. And they just feel like they're on quicksand. It feels like this whole system is rigged against them. And then to rub their noses in it, whole communities of people from foreign countries that have come here and their first act was to knowingly break our laws are rewarded for that by getting free accommodation on their dime. I mean, again, I keep going back to it. It's almost comic book villainry, I think. So the state needs to get smaller. But I would also say, we're unapologetic, for example, about we're very serious about wanting to ensure the United Kingdom is a great country, not just in 5 years and 10 years, but in 100 years, right? And the birth rate problem is a massive issue, right? We are the only party that is deadly serious about taking net migration to zero. Deadly serious, right? Labour and the Tories are basically engaged in human quantitative easing, right? Just open the borders, basically, right? And so you can flood the country with people where their birth rate, if you just look at the numbers, is around about double what the indigenous population is, okay? And if you look at what's happening now, is the current population in this country is about 68 million people, right? And let's look at what happens in 60 years' time, not 600 years. So 60 years, that is within the lifetimes of a lot of people listening to this show. In 60 years' time, the population, so if you cut net migration to zero, which is our plan, and the birth rate stays where it is, then the population is going to fall by 53%. The working age population in this country is going to fall by 2/3, at which point there will be more people in 60 years' time. There will be fewer people working than there will be people who are reliant on the tax proceeds from those people working. And that is a catastrophe. And by the way, that's without any assumptions about people fleeing, right? And so that is a catastrophic situation, right? Yeah. And I would put it to you that anybody who therefore unapologetic in saying British people having children, emphasis on British people having children, is an absolute good in and of itself, right? We've got to help people have children. We're going to have tax breaks. We've announced some of them, the transferable marriage allowance. But, when you talk about state intervention, right? So even if you're the biggest disciple of Adam Smith, my response would be, okay, do you think there are any occasions when the state should intervene, right? Do you think the police should be private things? But no, of course, you've got to have, just because you're poor shouldn't mean that you don't get police or fire services, right? I very much doubt anyone would argue. Okay, so the state has a role. Do you think, so let's talk about market failure. Generally, you would assume state intervenes when there's market failure. Is the total collapse of the population of this country, where we talk about hundreds of years, if you carry on at 1.44 birth rate, zero net migration, in under 500 years, there are basically zero humans left in this country, right? Is that not the ultimate form? I mean, if that isn't market failure, then you'd have to explain to me what market failure is.
But is that market failure induced by government policy?
Well, look, the birth rate problem is a multivariate problem, and it's not. I'm not sitting here claiming it's like a super easy problem to solve. Nor am I claiming that lifting the cap is like some silver bullet. Of course not, right? But the notion that the government should not be doing everything in its power to help British people who want to have children, who are fertile, to have them, I think is ridiculous. And so we should have, and this is again something we're working on. If you set your alarm clock in the morning, we want to make sure that every instrument of state is pointed toward trying to solve this. It's just like in business, right? So this is our background, right? Apple, one of the things I've noticed as well about Westminster and politics is everything's super incoherent, right? The Treasury's at odds with the Home Office, and that's why you can't do anything, right? It's like, oh, no, you can't cut net migration because you need it for the... when Apple releases a new product, every instrument, they release an iPhone, it's like every instrument of Apple is pointed at that. Likewise, Amazon, likewise, the greatest companies in the world, right? Or Tesla, or whatever it is, right? When Tesla's creating its autonomous driving cars, it's got, it's focused on delivering a car that's comfortable and smooth, and the engineering on the car is really good. It's got a world-class manufacturing process that allows them to produce the cars at scale, at speed. It's had telemetrics and cameras on their cars now for years, collecting huge amounts of data, and it has probably the best in the world algorithms to actually deliver the self-driving algorithm so that they're minimizing interventions. If any one of those things were not true, they wouldn't be in the position where they are now, right? That's how we need to think about a government, right? We need to think about everything we're doing coherently. What are the biggest problems the country faces? The birth rate is one. And again, I put it to you, if somebody's arguing against the things we're talking about here, helping British people have children, and Nigel is the only political leader, I would argue, in probably my lifetime, actually, who has a real shot at Downing Street, who's talking about the birth rate in this country. When was the last time you heard someone seriously talk about that as a problem? Even though it is actually, here's the irony, he's the only one talking about it. It's actually the most fundamental problem if you actually care about the future of this country as opposed to just the next 2 years that we have. So that's what we've got to focus on. Similarly, we talk about culture in this country. We talk about law and order and crime. All of these things are connected. And if we don't get the economy growing again, if we don't give people in this country a sense that at least their political leaders are on their team. Here's the other thing, right? People in the United Kingdom have a proud history of making sacrifices when it mattered, obviously, right? Obviously, during wars, during all sorts of extraordinarily harrowing situations. I'd argue the proudest history in the world. And I mean, look at slavery. Children are being taught in schools that they should hate their history, right? Yet the West Africa Squadron was deployed to the high seas to enforce. The UK was the first country to abolish the slave trade. There's no precedent for that. Like there was did it and then created a new Navy squadron, deployed it onto the high seas, and the country lost tens of thousands of sailors and a huge amount of its treasury. It spilled blood and treasure to take down those slave ships, right? And again, that's unprecedented, I would argue, in history, something we should be very proud of. If you meet a 15 or 16-year-old, ask them whether they know anything about that story. I put it to you that they wouldn't. I didn't know anything about it until after I went to school, obviously, some time ago. So these things are really important. And if we're not, we need to ensure that our children understand what our history is, but we also need to make sure that we don't take advantage of that. And that's what's happened. So it's not like British people need to be told there's infinite money for everything, right? That's not the case. They're not stupid. They have a very good sense that people are just telling people what they want to hear. But what's happening is there's this insane situation where British people are told when it comes to our interests, there's no money left, right? So winter fuel allowance. We've got to save 1.5 billion. So we're withdrawing the winter fuel allowance from pensioners. And look, are there some pensioners there who are millionaires who didn't need it? Sure. There are many, because I've spoken to them on the doorstep, who absolutely did need it, who were devastated by it, who have to borrow money. I remember very vividly a story where I was speaking to a lady who was a lifelong Labour voter, actually. She said she's going to vote Reform now because she said, I would obviously not have voted Labour if I knew they were going to take the winter fuel allowance. So I'm now borrowing money from my grandson to a huge... She said she was extraordinarily ashamed of that. And so that was to save supposedly 1.5 billion. And yet to give away Chagos, there's 30 billion, right? There's infinite money. The 1,000 people who came across the channel illegally, how much is that going to cost, right? So there's billions available for foreign citizens, 15 billion in the form of foreign aid. So what's that?
That's our debt level at the moment.
Yeah, so it's infinite money available for foreign citizens. There's no money left for British citizens. And I put it to you that if you just stopped the insanity of free stuff for people who come here illegally and all of that stuff and sending money, our foreign aid budget sends money to India, which is a country that has its own space program and now possesses hypersonic missiles that appear to be capable of penetrating our own missile defense systems. And we're sending them foreign aid. Well, like I said, let me reiterate, there are 13-year-olds in Wales whose educational attainment is below the OECD average. And there are 19,000 people in the year before last. We haven't had the data yet for last year, but the year before last, you had to wait more than 3 days in accident and emergency. Imagine going to accident and emergency, and it's a horrible, horrible thing to have to happen to you, and having to wait 3 days to get treatment. I mean, that is a third world statistic, yet we have £15 billion to send. So the point being is, if we were able to look people in the eyes in this country and say, look, we've cut all of the ridiculous discretionary stuff, right? We're going to put you first. I think the whole mood of the country would be very different. But every time you hear a politician say the words, difficult decisions need to be made, invariably those difficult decisions end up enriching foreign citizens over British ones. And nothing against foreign citizens, but the solemn duty of the government of the United Kingdom is to look after its own citizens.
Very important that you don't lose this, okay? This is your inheritance through Bitcoin.
Let Bitcoin rip. Don't rip up your Bitcoin. Set up inheritance with Casa.
Let's talk about the budget, because I've seen your interviews and other members of Reform's interviews talking about the budget. and they'll talk about certain policies and say, how will you fund this? So, and you give examples of maybe hotels and HMOs, we could cut that. That's great. But you, as somebody who's operated businesses like me, know that annually you prepare a budget. So my football team, I'm out to New York next Sunday. I'm going to see the board and presenting the budget, and I plan the whole year.
Yeah.
And if there are issues with the budget in our regular board meetings, I'll say, look, we need more money. It has to be a board decision, or there's cuts. We have a Labour Party I've lost count of the amount of times they've broken their manifesto. Is it possible? What I would love to see from a party is to present its budget. And I know it's hard because you maybe don't know everything till you get into government, but present its budget beforehand. Because there is funding the new ideas that you have, but we're already running a deficit of about, is it 150 billion now? I mean, it's at least 100 billion. Yeah. If we continue to increase the deficit, if we continue to grow our debt, we continue to have to inject capital into the market. You will know expansion of the money supply always leads to inflation, widens the wealth gap, makes the poorest poorer, and it kills the middle class. Yep. Is there a way that reform could come and say, here it is, this is our budget, we've balanced it?
Yeah, look, we're going to be very transparent with the British people about what our plans are. I think one of the reasons why Keir Starmer's approval ratings have collapsed at historic speed, right? Unheard of, is because it's not necessarily because his policies were unpopular with like me or you, to be honest, right? Because he was never, when he was going for power, me and you were never going to vote for him, right? It's because none of his most unpopular policies, and God knows there are a lot to choose from in that category, were in his manifesto, right? The winter fuel allowance being withdrawn, the raid on farmers, the increase in national insurance contribution, the ceding of sovereign territory in the form of Chagos. None of this was in their manifesto. So if you don't tell people what you're going to do, and frankly, no one really knew, he also wouldn't have won, let's be honest, right? Even though he won a big majority, that is a esoteric result of a first past the post system. He won fewer votes than Jeremy Corbyn did both times Jeremy Corbyn ran. People forget this, right? So there was no brand equity. Let's talk about brand equity, right? So, you talk about an iPhone. So, I'll give you an even better story. Tesla, when they launched the Roadster, Tesla started with this Tesla Roadster, obviously back in the day, a long time ago. And the whole idea was to demonstrate, it was based on a Lotus Elise chassis. And what they were trying to, at the time, the Chevy Volt had supposedly, one of the mightiest car companies in the world, had basically proven that electric cars were non-viable, right? People didn't want them. And obviously you had the fossil fuel lobby and all the formidable opponents to any form of electric car. And Elon's view was, no, actually electric cars could actually be really fun and fast and cool. And because unlike an internal combustion engine, electromotors can put their power down immediately, you could make a car that was actually pretty special. So he started with this Roadster, and there was only one, I think there were two dealers, one in San Francisco, I think it was Palo Alto, near Menlo Park, and Monaco or something, like just the most ridiculous places to have dealers. And it was a very expensive car. And the range was ridiculously low. It was like 25 miles or, not 400 miles. And he started selling this car, and obviously he got celebrities and stuff to drive them. But it was interesting because the car was very unreliable, but people were buying into something, right? And it was a lot of fun, that car. I've never driven one, but apparently it was exactly what people know of electric cars now. And so the idea was that instead of electric cars being this boring kind of appliance that paled in comparison to an internal combustion engine, it was actually an amazing product that was fun and cool, and the coolest people in the world wanted them. And Elon's obviously always been, amazing at doing that stuff. So what really matters here is when you're creating something new and, you want people to change their behavior and you want perceptions around a certain space to change, you have to start somewhere and you have to start small. And obviously, fast forward today, Tesla's market cap is north of $1 trillion now. They're probably, I think that it's going to multiply from here. But ultimately, you have to have a real sense of how human beings involved in any given process think. And that's the thing that really struck me when I talked to people at the doorstep across the country. I don't think there's been a politician in this country for a very long time who has actually thought about what's the experience of a human being, a citizen of the United Kingdom, living in this country. Like, genuinely, I know it sounds crazy.
No, I mean,
no one thinks about that.
Yeah.
And so it's like, okay, well, I'll give you one example. One of the reasons that we want to, one of the first tax cuts we'll do is raising the threshold at which point you pay income tax to £20,000 a year. And one reason is because if you are currently on benefits and you start working more than 16 hours a week, once you start working more than 16 hours, you literally have less money in your bank account at the end of the month when you take into account the loss of benefits. Now, that's been true for a long time. The fact that that's not even being talked about in Westminster is ridiculous to me. Similarly, okay, when we talk about proponents for mass immigration, they go, well, Zia, you need all of these immigrants to staff our NHS. And look, both my parents obviously came to this country in the early 1980s, and they've given north of 50 years of service to the NHS between them. So I'm acutely aware of the contribution immigrants can make and have made to the country and the NHS. But let's be clear about something. You could restaff every doctor and nurse in the NHS with 6 months of net immigration as things currently stand, right? And one of the reasons that this country is taking doctors from very poor countries in many cases is because we have this ridiculous cap on homegrown. Yeah. But how is that still? It's still in place. Like, as we speak, why is the Prime Minister not calling a cabinet meeting going, okay, can we just stop actively self-harming? Can we just take away that cap of 9,500 homegrown doctors?
Another thing we don't talk about that actually bothers me is that we don't discuss the impact it has on the health service of the countries we're taking these from. It's like we have this privilege that we can just take these people because we need them. It's like, some of these countries actually need those doctors, need those nurses themselves. I think that's an important part of the discussion we don't have.
I think it is, but we're quite unapologetically, I gave an interview with Bloomberg last week, and we're pretty unapologetic about saying, look, every decision that Nigel will make as Prime Minister will be just relentlessly through an algorithm of what's in the interests of British people. So I agree with that statement. And by the way, the other interesting thing when you talk about, be kind and the compassionate class, right? They're also the ones who say we should not do anything to stop the boats from coming. Yet hundreds of people have tragically lost their lives, including children, from those journeys as a result of human traffickers doing that stuff. So, that whole Be Kind brigade, their empathy to let's give them the benefit of the doubt, right? And say that they're well-intentioned, and not all of them are, but let's assume some of them are. It is completely misplaced. And again, what we need now is a return of rule of law. We need to uphold our borders. I mean, this morning, I think it was on Sky, there was this rolling headlines. Has the government lost control of our borders? And I didn't actually get asked, have they lost? I said, in order to lose control of something, you need to have had control, definitionally, in the recent past. When was the last time we had control of our borders? It's a farce, right? And in actual fact, you know what's crazy if you talk about immigration? It is much easier currently in this country to get into the UK as a murderer, as a convicted murderer, than as a Nobel Prize winner. It's true. Because a Nobel Prize winner isn't going to board,
Yeah. On the migration issue, it's a hot topic at the moment. It's talked about by a lot of people. A lot of people are frustrated by it. It's definitely appealing in the ballot box. But there's a risk that it just becomes overtly racist. And you as a Muslim, it's interesting to ask you this question because I agree we have a problem with immigration, but politics is a spectrum. When it's covered on interviews on this show, I read the YouTube comments, and there's just some overtly racist statements that things such as, well, solve your problem, you just need to get rid of all the brown people. So there is a dog whistle that exists. How do you, as a Muslim, how do you square that circle that we deal with immigration, but we don't let it become just a racist issue?
Well, I think, look, the first thing is that the number of people actually racist in this country is extraordinarily small. I mean, does it exist? Yes. Frankly, I think, to be blunt, there's far more demand for racism in this country, particularly from the media class, than there is supply. So not to minimize and say it doesn't exist, it does. But they're not that many in number. The way so to answer your question directly, you just actually think very deeply about how you solve the country's problems. And then you go and make the case to the British people, as Nigel has done, as the party has done, as our MPs have done. And that's what we're going to keep doing. And so far it's working. So, ultimately, Nigel's been crystal clear. This is not, when I first came on the scene in politics about a year ago, it doesn't really happen anymore, but when I first came on the scene, I remember my first few media interviews with, I won't name the outlets, but, mainstream media, were asking me, why would you be interested in joining a party that's been accused of Islamophobia or, and they don't really do that anymore. And by the way, almost invariably, the people asking me that question were white, liberal sort of people. And I'll give you this little anecdote. I remember one, I won't embarrass them by naming them. They said, Mr. Yusuf, your parents came here as migrants. You're a second generation immigrant, and now you're saying that net migration should be zero and you should stop the boats. Aren't you simply trying to pull the ladder up from behind you? And I said, well, I was born in Scotland. I was raised in London. I certainly didn't clamber up a ladder, let alone trying to pull it up. So just the premise of that question was so, ironically, it was actually them being exactly the thing that they were trying to accuse our party of. Look, ultimately, what people in this country care about is, again, the sovereignty of the country. So if you don't have borders, you don't have a country, right? Number one. Number two, they want people who are willing to stand up for British people. And to the degree that has not been done, shambolically now, for decades, look, if I've always had the view, and I forget who actually said this, it was someone far smarter than me, but they said that if reasonable people do not secure our borders, unreasonable people will eventually. And I do believe that. And the good news is we have very reasonable people now looking to do such a thing, not just claiming they're going to do it, but someone who's campaigned on. I mean, look, do you remember that billboard that Nigel was in front of talking about an invasion? And, look at the number of people who have crossed the channel legally now. Is in the hundreds of thousands. It is a slow motion D-Day in the reverse, right? And now you have confirmation that there was somebody who came across the channel, an Iranian, who tried to engage in what would have been a devastating, I think, terrorist attack on this country that was foiled. You had a man who was being escorted. I still remember this because I was with Nigel in Parliament at the time. You had the madness of a man who had gone on TikTok. Do you remember he had a Kalashnikov tattoo on his face, saying that he was coming here to murder a sitting member of Parliament who happens to be the leader of our party. And he was being escorted. He then into TikTok where he was being escorted to British waters by the French Navy. I mean,
it's crazy.
And some of the comments were replying on Twitter, like, you guys should, the Brits should invoke NATO's article. It's like, but I understand where some of this stuff comes from because we're living in this, we're so, I think, now desensitized to the sheer insanity of this stuff. This is a national security emergency. And none of this has anything to do with race. Look, I will say this, though. I will say this. If you're formulating an immigration policy, look, you hire people into your business, right? Do you have a component? Presumably you interview them, right? Presumably you know who they are, firstly, right? And then you interview them, right? Here's what you don't do. You don't, at the downstairs in your office, just have a sign saying, I've left the doors unlocked. Please don't come in unless you're actually an employee. But by the way, if you do come in, I'll hire you and give you loads of benefits and you'll be unfireable. Like, I presume you wouldn't do that.
Well, I wouldn't do that, but I think Labour want to make it so.
But that's what we've had in this country, right? That's what we've actually had in this country. I'm only partially being facetious to say that a Nobel laureate will find it much harder to come here than a convicted murderer. The current way our immigration system is set up, and so when you're interviewing people, right, for your companies, do you have any component of like cultural fit or just to work out whether people are going to be a good fit with your team?
Well, I mean, in my coffee shop, they're customer facing. They have to be well presented.
Yeah.
They have to have a positive attitude. They have to be able to talk to people. Yeah. Which, by the way, is a challenge with some young people at the moment. But yeah, no, of course there has to be a cultural fit.
Right. So you're thinking, right. We should absolutely think about cultural fit if you're trying to bring people into our country. So, we're talking about bringing net migration down to zero. Obviously, a few 100,000 people do leave the country each year. There are going to be something like if somebody wants to come here and invest millions of pounds, right? If somebody wants to come here, there might be acute areas of acute need in terms of labor shortages, where maybe there's some short-term requirements for some visas coming up that has to be done in conjunction with a mass mobilization of capability to to recruit, train and recruit British workers to do those jobs, something that never happens, by the way. But if you do those things, then you're going to have a situation where people assimilate and we're not spending insane amount. I mean, how on earth the taxpayers having to fund translators? I think it was Kent County Council that was paying, which we're now thankfully in control of, that was paying for driving lessons for free for asylum seekers. How does that work when somebody earning £28,000 in their household income, who's worked their entire lives, who was born here, done everything right, they're paying for their driving lessons? But somebody who has come here, in some cases illegally, and look, I'm not saying every asylum seeker is bogus, but there are obviously a lot of bogus asylum seekers. And above all else, again, I hope that our aim is to have a country that stands tall again in the world and is a major player in the world. And absolutely, should we aspire to give foreign aid? Should we aspire to have a small number of people who are able to come here on asylum, not come here and then claim it, but apply through proper channels? We're nowhere close to being in a position where any of that, frankly, is possible because our own people, in many cases, are in poverty or just being utterly screwed by the system. So we have to have something of a moratorium on all of that stuff. And we have to put, and I keep saying it, it's not that hard. We've just got to put every decision through an algorithm of what's in the interests of citizens of the United Kingdom.
Right, let's talk about this digital assets bill.
Yeah.
Obviously, I'm a huge fan. My background, this show, previous to becoming the Peter McCormack show, was called What Bitcoin Did. We made 860 shows about Bitcoin. I've traveled the world. I've interviewed President Bukele.
Really? What's he like?
He has a presence, an imposing presence, but really interesting guy. Deep knowledge on Bitcoin that he acquired very quickly. I was really, really impressed with him. But I've interviewed a bunch of people in the US, Vivek Ramaswamy, RFK. I've traveled the world interviewing people about Bitcoin. I've been out to Kenya, Malawi, Ghana, and seeing how people are using Bitcoin to deliver jobs and opportunity in those countries. I work closely with the Oslo Freedom Forum, how they empower activists with Bitcoin. I'm a huge supporter of Bitcoin. I've always been really disappointed how anti-Bitcoin our country is. How I've lost 4 bank accounts because listen to this mad one. And I loved your non-discrimination on bank accounts because I know what Nigel went through, but I lost a bank account because I had an invoice paid from a Bitcoin company. I have the contract, it's fully legal, but I lost, and they froze my assets, and they were released 2 days before payroll. I mean, this is the insanity. So I'm a big supporter of anyone who's pro-Bitcoin because it's pro-freedom. And also, Bitcoin has enabled me to escape the inflationary madness of this country. Yeah. I love it because it's shifted the Overton window on the conversation around this. So I love it all. But it just came out of nowhere. I knew Nigel was going out to Vegas, but I just didn't see it coming. And so this is a massive policy. It's a really interesting policy. It's a set of policies, sorry. But you could have been talking about other things at this time. You've come out with this. So where did this come from?
So look, we're a party that is really the only party with pretty strong support across all the generations, ranging from Gen Z, all the voting age generation, Gen Z, millennials, Gen X, and beyond, right, boomers and beyond. And that puts us in, I think that gives us a really important responsibility, because I think that you can talk about fixing the social contract. If it's just, there's nothing wrong with being old, right? But if the Tory party, to the degree they have any support left, it's basically north of 65. Again, nothing wrong with that at all. But the reality is that in order to fix the problems the country has, there has to be a social contract also between, pensioners, people of pension age, and the youngest in society. That has to work. And everybody understands that, by the way, when you actually talk to people. But the problem is in politics, it's always, everything's super reductive, and it's always just, let's buy off that particular group with a certain policy. I'm obviously a tech entrepreneur.
Mm-hmm.
I am firmly of the view that Britain needs to lean into its strengths. So we're in politics because we think Britain can be an amazing country again. Like, that is why we're here. We're not here for managed decline. And most politicians I meet in Westminster, whether they admit it or not, the whole frame is managed decline. Pump the patient with as much morphine as is necessary to make it as comfortable as it can while it fades into utter irrelevance, and maybe even worse than that, right? We think something much better is possible. It's a time-limited mission. I think that we have to win a majority in 2029, which is why we're working as hard as we are, why Nigel's come out of retirement to do this. So we think, look, what are the strengths of the country? We have a significant percentage of the world's finest AI engineers in this country. We have 3 of the top universities in the world in terms of STEM, in terms of, I think, 3 of the top 15 universities in the world are here. We don't do much commercially with those compared to the US, Californian universities in particular. We have still a pretty formidable financial center, although fading, relatively speaking, compared to many other financial centers in the world. And I don't think people are fully aware of the speed at which, even, forget about New York and Paris and stuff, which are obviously competitors, but go and look at Trump's visit to the Middle East, where they're building these enormous AI campuses. And, so competition to the UK, we're not living in a vacuum. And I think crypto and in particular digital assets is a huge opportunity for this country. That's why, for example, and it's a bit esoteric and boring maybe for some people, it's really important, that regulatory sandbox that we want to create to allow serious financial institutions, instead of trying to persecute people. I don't know who that bank was, but frankly, everyone's petrified. You connect your Coinbase account to something and you're just worried the whole account will be frozen or you'll get locked out or completely debanked. And there's nothing about that that's remotely acceptable. So that's why we want to cut capital gains tax on crypto assets to 10%. We want to encourage the brightest and the best in terms of crypto to come here. And, the conversations we've already had with big decision makers in this space, whether it's C-suite executives in the city, whether it's startup founders, whether it's the big exchanges, are very pleased with this. I want to be clear, though, this is not the totality. It's not a comprehensive reform policy in the space, but it is an important firing gun. And as you said, you said it came out of nowhere. Look, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by what we're going to be delivering over the coming years. We've got to lean in to making Britain one of the most innovative economies in the world. And what's really interesting as well, we talk about the mainstream media, with some exceptions, a lot of people just don't understand this at all. Somebody, I spoke to somebody from a very reputable political magazine who said, well, Warren Buffett says it's a Ponzi scheme. So I said, listen, we just talked about Charlie Munger. I have huge respect for the late Charlie Munger, obviously. I have huge respect for Warren Buffett, but he's also said he's never owned gold.
He called Bitcoin rat poison.
Rat poison. He's never owned gold. And as amazing as Berkshire Hathaway is, it has underperformed the S&P for a number of years. Now, he's not God, right? And he's of a certain generation. The world is changing at a dramatic speed. And look, there is a creeping authoritarianism that is creeping into a lot of Western countries now through the financial system. You had Operation Choke Point in the US very famously. And then, I had another question, which was, one of the reasons why Bitcoin is more in vogue and is going up in prices is because the Trump administration is getting behind it. I'm like, and?
Yeah.
Whatever you think of President Trump, he is the president of the most formidable economy in the world. And by the way, the idea that America, let's say hypothetically, the Democrats won the next election, the idea that suddenly all of the reserves, we want to create a Bitcoin reserve, all of the crypto would just be liquidated and the industry would be left, I think is for the birds, right? We are heading, 1 in 4 people in this country aged between 18 and 34 already own crypto. It's probably much higher than that. We usually try to use conservative figures on this stuff. That's only going to grow. And those 18 to 34-year-olds will be 50 in a couple of decades' time, right? So it's why I keep telling people, we've got to think about what Britain looks like, not just in 2 years' time. And I know that's not in the muscle memory of most politicians, but we do actually think very deeply about this stuff because we want to live. I don't have kids yet. I want to have kids and I want them to grow up in this country and I want their kids to grow up in this country. And so we've got to start getting this country to a point where at the very least we're competitive on the world stage. If, as I said, I did an interview with Bloomberg, I said, you can imagine we're still living in the 1970s if you want. But the only result of that will be is that the United Kingdom just gets left, not just behind, but left for dead in the coming decades.
There's so many things I could talk to you about this. The digital asset, the national Bitcoin reserve, I think is a hugely important policy. And the fact that you guys have recognised that and include that within the bill, I think is fascinating. One thing I do want to talk about, though, is KYC. Mm-hmm. There is been a proliferation of attacks on people who own Bitcoin. And one thing that Bitcoiners fear is that every time they have to sign up for something, they have to provide all their KYC AML information. Those databases are regularly attacked and they're released, and suddenly this person owns this much Bitcoin. And by the way, this is their address because they're on company's house. Introduce all this risk. A guy from Ledger in France had his finger cut off. We saw a video recently of somebody trying to be kidnapped. We seem to live in a country now where privacy isn't respected. Actually, the state has the right to all the information on you all the time, and we take, as a citizen, take all the risk. At the same time, I'm not in government. I'm not in the within the MI6 or MI5, and I don't know the work they have to do to try and keep the country safe. How do we balance that?
Well, the first thing to say is that we're currently in a pretty catastrophic situation in terms of privacy in this country. So you may have seen that Apple, again, everyone's sort of memory hold it now because so much news whizzes past us. But one of the most worrying Orwellian developments was that Apple withdrew its highest form of encryption to UK citizens because the government basically demanded a backdoor. And when you drill into that, and you remember there were some fights that were had about this in the United States. You remember the FBI were trying to get into phone, and Apple stood its ground. Frankly, to their credit, I don't think Apple's a perfect company by any means, but to their credit, Apple stood its ground and said, we're not going to give governments a backdoor into our end-to-end encryption.
Was that San Bernardino, the shooting?
Yes,
I remember,
Correct. And now we're in a situation in the UK where the British government said, no, you need to give us access to it. And when you actually drill into the legislation around this stuff, what's so terrifying about it is that it's just a rando from the Home Office could ask for your personal information. You wouldn't even be told. In fact, Apple would be forbidden from telling you that your photos, your notes, your messages, basically everything that sits inside the end-to-end encryption inside iCloud, especially if you pay for the highest form of encryption that a lot of people will do, will just be made available to the government. And just think about how much the government, people in positions of authority and power that can implement weapons of state against people. Just think about how terrifying that could be. So we're in a very dangerous place in that regard. That is one reason why we think this is important. As you said, no one knows more the dangers of debanking. And Nigel was literally not just debanked, right? But publicly, they tried to put him through a ritual public humiliation. Now, it didn't work, but that's what they tried. Do you remember
I remember
the BBC was running stories where there was a picture of Nigel saying Farage doesn't have enough money to be able to be a customer. All absolute nonsense, right? But it was one of the most horrific. I remember just looking at this going, this is outrageous, absolutely outrageous. And then the lady who was just, was sat next to a journalist, and anyway, I think she got what was coming for to her in the end, right? In the sense that I think she lost a multi-million-pound pension. But this is what happens when people in positions of power are able to wield that power, and banks should not be allowed to debank somebody. I mean, if financial services are withdrawn from somebody completely, you pretty much are unpersoned. Right, it's almost impossible to do anything, right, seriously as a citizen in that country. So I think all of that is important. We do have to find the right balance, right? I will say this, though, again, just to emphasize, we can have a discussion about what the right balance is, but we're so far away from where we need to be that the first thing we need to do is stop the insane stuff. So, again, you look at privacy, right, and this level of surveillance where so many people are being, their doors are being knocked on because of social media posts. And as you say, there's this snoopers charter that would give people access to the highest form, allow the government to defeat Apple's highest form of encryption without Apple and forbidding Apple to even tell you, even if you hadn't even been convicted of a crime. While all of that's going on, less than 1% of people nicking phones are even identified. How does that work? Right? Like in a city that has a CCTV camera per capita ratio up there with pretty much any country in the world, including and especially Chinese cities, right? So again, it's a question of priorities. What do our politicians care about? They are so much more concerned about people writing words on social media. And again, just to emphasize, we're not defending some of the moderation on social media is a difficult problem. It just is, right? But the reality is we have a government, and we've had successive governments now in this country who have trained their target sites so far off the mark that people are pretty sick of it.
So on this podcast, you are definitely hearing me talk about Bitcoin a lot. Well, why? We live in a really strange time with governments driving inflation with their reckless spending and endless money printing. There is a way out of this. There is a way to protect your money, and that is by stacking Bitcoin. I've made loads of shows about Bitcoin. You can go and research this. You can go and read the books. But the truth is, it is the hardest money ever created. If you are interested in protecting your financial future, it's time for you to get on the Bitcoin train. I've been stacking Bitcoin personally and through my businesses since 2017. It's protected me, it's secured my family's future, and it also strengthens all of my businesses. So if you want to start stacking Bitcoin, where do you do it? Well, for me, it's with Gemini. They're a fully licensed, full reserve exchange and custodian, so they give you a secure way for you to buy and own your Bitcoin. There's no risks and no funny business. So if you're serious about stacking Bitcoin the right way, head over to Gemini.com, which is GEMINI.com. I'm conscious of your time, but there's a couple of things I do still want to get into with you. Energy policy.
Yeah.
So this also does relate very well to your digital asset bill. And one area of exploration, and we don't have to discuss this now, but I think would be interesting is that I know some of the Bitcoin miners very well. Some of them have huge operations out in the US. They're directly integrated with the grid, able to bring down energy bills for their customers. What's this called? That's grid backloss. But we curtail about £1 billion a year of wind, maybe more. I know people who would 1.5 billion. I know people who run companies, Bitcoin mining companies, who would move here tomorrow and say, we'll buy that off you. You don't need to curtail it. But we as a country we are not creating an environment where they can do that. Yeah. We have a hostile environment. And I don't need you to answer on that specific policy now, but overall on energy, our energy prices are fucking insane, man.
The most expensive in the world.
Yeah, most expensive in the world. Yeah, I haven't even been able to find out why. I'm trying to look into this. I just cannot get to the bottom of why our energy prices are so high. But it certainly is something that's caused certain amounts of deindustrialization. It's some of the biggest line items in my P&L for my companies, and it certainly affects our profitability, which affects our budgets for marketing, which affects our budgets for recruitment. How the hell do we get these energy prices down?
Well, the primary reason is because of the crazy net zero policies and the endless persecution of producers of low-cost energy. Like, it's pretty straightforward. And so, and it's pretty ironic, actually, because this country does have a lot. It's actually a pretty resource-rich country if we chose to actually utilize it in lots of different ways, right? In the form of natural gas, but then you can also talk about Rolls-Royce and their small modular reactor technologies. I mean, you will not find, I think one of the hallmark achievements, I am keen that we would set a target of having small modular reactors delivering power at scale inside Nigel's first term as Prime Minister. Now, that is power that
4 years.
No, yeah, I look. It's definitely a stretch goal. It's a stretch target.
Yeah,
but if you actually dig into, so it will not be easy. But if you actually look at why this stuff hasn't been rolled out yet, one of the reasons, it's not because the tech isn't there. I mean, SMR technology, and a total lack of confidence in the private markets, including for the actual manufacturers, right? Because, but yes, regulatory is the number one factor. If you look at small modular reactors, the tech itself has been around for a long time. I mean, there's submarines that our Navy operate. The tech is not revolutionary. In Rolls-Royce, even though that's a nation product for them, this is a national champion that we have that is pretty darn good at creating extremely high cost of failure, extremely complex assembled engineering products like aerospace engines, right? And if you look at what SMRs can do, obviously north of 90%, so north of 85% of the product is assembled inside a factory, right? So if you actually had a first principles approach to regulation, then what you would do is say, okay, well, once you kind of know what you're doing at a certain point, and then you had a first principle approach with the grid. If you put these things, a lot of the coal plants sadly have been shut down. You could put these things where those were. A lot of the ones have been shut down, so you have direct access to the grid. Look, it's a tall order to get it done in 5 years, but even if we come close to that, it's still on a totally different puts the country in a totally different trajectory. And obviously, that is a hell of a lot of megawatt power, megawatt capacity that we're going to put in place. And of course, it's zero emissions. This is funny because when we say we're anti-net zero policies, people think we're just obsessed about fossil fuels. So no, look, we understand what CO2 emissions are, and look, we want to live in a country that is beautiful and is clean air, and we want our grandkids to breathe clean air. And nuclear is zero emissions. But the problem is you've had, again, successive governments. I mean, I talk to people, CEOs in that space, who tell me, Zia, how can you expect us to have any confidence in investing in this stuff and building up manufacturing capacity when we shook hands with somebody on an important line around a subsidy and, bureaucratic stuff getting cleared out of the way, a chancellor, and then that chancellor, and this wasn't that long ago, was fired, and then their predecessor was fired 2 days later. There were 3 chancellors in a week. I mean, that's the kind of joke of a country we've lived in. So nuclear is not something you can just flip on and off overnight. Obviously, you've got to actually invest in it. But look at France, right? 70% of France's installed base of power generation is nuclear. And that's why, and we haven't talked about AI, but power is now the limiting factor in the form of, in terms of AI. And these big supercomputers, these GPU clusters, those are basically the new nuclear weapons. And actually more utility than nuclear weapons because they have a lot of productive capability as well as destructive capability and will be critical in actually defending against attacks from adversaries. I'll give you an interesting data point. If you look at the big 5 NASDAQ, US NASDAQ tech companies, they already have 40% as much energy capacity as the UK does in their private ownership. And within 8 years, they will surpass the UK. So 5 private companies in the United States will have more energy capacity at their disposal, again, to power all of these things, these data centers, than the UK has. Here's another data point. We talk about net zero and this endless obsession with zero. We've got to just unilaterally disarm and everyone be poorer, especially the poorest in society need to get poorer and stop eating meat and stop flying anywhere in the name of net zero. Not only are we less than 1% of global carbon emissions, China is producing, China is growing its installed fleet of power generation capacity at such a rate that they're installing the equivalent of the entire UK fleet every 2 months. I'll say that again. They're installing the entire capacity of power generation the UK has every 2 months. We shut down, we were so sure this country, our moronic politicians were so sure and so virtuous that we needed to shut down all our coal plants that we blew them all up. And we're now in a situation where China last year, do you know how many tons of coal they produced? 4.6 billion. And it was up another 3%. We were always told it goes down. It only ever goes up. The Chinese are smart. They're very smart. And they are, I mean, frankly, they've overtaken us in many ways. Now, again, I don't want to be I don't want to catastrophize here because the reason I'm doing this is because I think the country can be awesome again. And there is a way back for us, but it is a time-limited mission. We have to have serious competence again in government. We have to make the case to the British people that these things are important. We have to stop self-immolating. I mean, how many manufacturers do you speak to where they say, yeah, I mean, the energy costs are just utterly bewildering. And you have Mad Ed Miliband running around. I mean, he's trying to now increase tax. So it's kind of, if we just stopped, I have a view that if you take out very small countries like Monaco, and stuff, if you take out, in terms of big economies, I think the UK can be a top 5 GDP per capita country in the world again, from where we are now, like 27th and falling fast, right? If we just stopped self-immolating and self-harming and had politicians that weren't like, actively impeding the British economy, the UK would be in the top 10 very quickly.
I was with my friend Dan Roberts over on the weekend in Norway. His company's one of the top 3 Bitcoin mining companies in the world and probably the most profitable. They also, their sites are mixed usage sites where they provide AI compute alongside Bitcoin compute. Right. They only want to be in stable democracies with a rule of law. So they're in Canada, they're in America. They would be very interested to come to this country. They would definitely take a look. There's, like I say, 1.5 billion of energy that's being curtailed that they would happily pay a price for. But they feel like, well, I'm not going to answer for him. I think there are business owners and business operators internationally that think the UK is hostile to business. which means we're hostile to growth.
Mhm.
So, going a bit broader, thinking about the economy, and I'd add into that just a small micro version of that. I think town centres are hostile to growth with business rates. How do we as a country reverse that trend and go true pro-growth? What do you really want to see reform do to drive our economy forward?
So, number one, we have to cut our energy costs, right? So again, just going back to first
Yep.
principles and systems issues. If you keep energy costs where they are, the economy cannot grow more than 1%. There is no example. You've probably seen that distribution curve, right? There is no example of a fast-growing economy on the planet with high energy costs. The US has a cost lower than, I think, 60% lower than us. China north of 75% lower. So we need to collapse our energy costs. That's what Nigel will do when he's the Prime Minister. We'll focus on that ruthlessly. Secondly, we need to get the bureaucratic state out of the way. I mean, the bureaucratic state has become a parasitic estranglement of enterprise and innovation in this country. It's trying to get anything done, planning, and it's not even, if you talk to people on the wrong end of exactly.
I'm trying to build a football stadium.
Okay. And so is there a planning application in flight?
No, we're right at the very early stages of it. My brother works on that side of things, and we've talked about the project. I've looked at the construction of similar stadiums, and it's 12 to 14 months.
Yeah.
And my brother said the total project is 6 to 10 years. And I was like, why? He said planning. I was like, what? We're ready to put spades in the ground.
Hey, you're talking about a football stadium. Let's take the runway, the new runway, supposedly at Heathrow, where, according to Rachel Reeves herself, government guidance was going to take 10 years to build, albeit what needs to be quite a flat piece of tarmac. And obviously, if the government says it's going to be 10 years, you can multiply that, right? But China built an entire international airport in 2 years. It built a runway in about 6 weeks, right?
But think of the investment for a small town like Bedford, where I am. Yeah. It's a football stadium with the fastest growing club in the south of England. We've got international followers, people flying from all around the world to watch us. We've got US billionaire investors. Like, we are an economic engine for Bedford. If we build a stadium, it's not just a stadium, it's restaurants, maybe it's a hotel. It's an investment of tens of millions into the local economy. And we are just against a wall that's stopping us do this.
So again, you look at incentives, right?
Yeah.
So I spent quite a lot of time looking to lots of different plans. So what I like doing is looking at real situations where somebody comes to us with something like this. And as awful as that is, by the way, that's like 20th percentile in terms of the insanity that comes across into my inbox in terms of planning stuff, right? People waiting, in some cases, more than a decade for like really simple decisions, right, that need to be made. And again, it's a really common theme. It's not even like people say, it's not even like we object to the decision necessarily. It's the fact it took so long, whether it's people trying to build care homes, whether it's trying to build, exactly football stadiums, any of this stuff. So number one, let's look at incentives. The bureaucrats invariably have a massive incentive to string things out as long as possible, and no incentive to, in fact, a perverse incentive, right? Like a moral hazard in terms of approving anything. And that's why nuclear is a disaster, right? You look at HS2, billions and billions and billions and billions of pounds spent on it. Go and look into it. Go and look at the fact that their CEOs and CFOs keep changing pretty much yearly. Every time people are on massive 6-figure salaries, then they come and say, well, we've got to worry about the bats. And so,
I know.
All of this insanity, right? And that's why, if you look at countries like China and France, they pay around about 1/10 of what we do per mile of, the UK pays 13 times more per mile of high-speed rail than France and China. The reason I throw France in there is because France is not pretty good at health and safety as well, right? So, and then I dug down into that even more. And one of the issues with the high-speed 2 was, so if you look at the curve of sort of thinking about speed of the train in terms of the actual journey speed and cost, there obviously comes a certain point where you kind of can go faster, just like trying to make a car go like 200, 250 miles an hour, but then the cost starts to massively ramp for every incremental mile an hour. They never did that analysis. And so they just arbitrarily set a speed where there was like a crazy, if they had accepted a speed, I think it was about 18, 20 miles an hour less, it would have halved the cost. It was a ridiculously bad decision, partly because no analysis, had actually been done. They didn't do the tendering process properly. So, how will we solve this? Number one, massive simplification. There will be an absolute bonfire of red tape. We need to be much closer. Let's go and look at, there are countries that are pretty formidable at building, with very good health and safety records. And generally what you see is their planning rules, they're very clear. And basically, if it's not some black box and, do you know the planning officer? And the planning officer is a secretive, furtive character that's almost mythical, which raises its own eyebrows. And, you'll hear a lot more from us about what our Doge teams are going to be doing in these councils. Very interested to see what they unearth, because you can probably imagine where some of that stuff is going to go.
Mm-hmm.
But what we need to do is say, look, we need to have a planning system that is massively simplified. Obviously, before Attlee, it was the case that if it was your private land, you didn't need. Why should you even need planning permission on your own private land? Is my personal view, right? You paid for the land. If you want to put a loft conversion in, why should you need some council to give you permission? On big infrastructure projects, especially things, to your point, the football stadium is a social good. It helps. There are so many positive externalities. And not only are you not being helped, you're being actively impeded. Yet, if Yvette Cooper and Serco team up to disperse illegal migrants into that same area, they get a cheat code through planning. Local people don't even get a say. They don't even find out about it until after it's happened. Again, I go back to the point, we're not really in the phase of optimization. Do you see what I mean? It's like things are so bereft, so insane, so perverse that it'll take some time for us to get to the stage of optimization. But in terms of planning, we've got to have massive simplification. We're going to have, you'll notice in the crypto bill that we put out, the task forces, and sometimes you do need tasks. We need good people to go away and do some solid work on things. They get a very short period of time to actually come back to us. They don't get 2 years. I think they get 60 days. I think they get maybe 90 days of a short period of time. And for that to be extended, you need parliamentary approval again. Now, part of that is a human capital problem, working with people who, speed is a very important differentiator in business. You know this, right? The clock speed of an organization. Like, why can Tesla do so much so quickly? Why does Amazon? Because partly also why founder-led companies are so successful in the most of the big companies that are most successful, Jensen Huang, etc. It's because the founder has a lot of more moral authority. They are the CEO, and they can just do things very quickly. If you take that into government, you think about, okay, well, again, planning decisions. It's not saying that every single planning application will get accepted. Of course, there are arguments that sometimes need to be made on both sides, but we have to make those decisions much, much more quickly.
All right. Last thing I'm going to talk about. By the way, we could probably go for another 2 hours. I've got a lot of stuff I haven't talked about. I wanted to talk about local government. I wanted to talk about the health service, but we can do this again sometime. What has been fascinating with reform, and I'm not declaring a vote, I'm obviously sound like I'm pro-reform. I am, because you're speaking the language of the problems I'm facing, both as a parent and a business owner and a citizen. So it's an open door with me. But one of the really interesting things is that it's very hard to cast reform voters now. It was a lot easier before. It's very hard. I speak to wealthy, successful business owners. I speak to middle class. I speak to working class, former Labour voters who now of declaring they want to vote reform, former Conservative voters, people like me who haven't voted because we just we're politically homeless. No Lib Dems yet, but there is a broad coalition of people who are looking at reform as in some ways, I don't want to be too dramatic, but like the last hope. If we have another Labour administration, I think some people might be off, like myself, and so. How much pressure do you feel with this? Is it overwhelming? And how much of a challenge is it going to be to find 300, 400 viable candidates within 4 years?
So, of course, there's pressure, but we knew that getting into this.
Yeah.
And not just pressure for me or for Nigel or for our MPs, but, everybody who does incredible work for reform, our volunteers and our branches and our councillors now. We have north of 700 councillors, having had 9 a year ago. So of course there's pressure, but it's the highest honor. It's I think the best form of public service we could do. Anything important, by definition, comes with pressure, right? Now, what that translates into is a real sense of purpose. Like, we're very mission oriented, right? I don't get paid to do. I 12, 15 hours a day, 7 days a week. I do this completely for free. It's all I do. I've given up all my business interests because I do think this is a time limited mission. So does Nigel. I mean, Nigel's turned down. I mean, the opportunity cost for Nigel financially is enormous in doing this. He has 6 former SAS and SBS officers who have to protect him, around the clock. Nobody is more unfairly vilified. Equally, I don't think anyone's more actually loved now in British politics as well, because people are actually starting to understand who Nigel is, and that's why we've been going up in the polls so much. But the only thing we can do is keep thinking about what is in the best interest of the British people. How do we listen to them? How do we articulate their concerns? And how do we formulate smart policies so that we can start to arrest the decline and make the country awesome again? And in terms of finding talent, I have asymmetric data on this because I'm the chairman of the party, right? And I've been saying for some time that the talent density curve that's happening in reform pretty much on a weekly basis is ridiculous. So you'll see, the people in our Doge team. We've got one of the foremost British entrepreneur running that for us, a data scientist, former turnaround CEO. He's got a team of like weapons grade software engineers and data scientists who are going to go in, all working for free. And this like blows people's line because, our opponents go, well, why would you want to audit the councils? Aren't you going to spend millions of taxpayer money on KPMGs? And no. Like most of these councils actually do have external auditors. They're just not, they're just not looking for the right things. And so there are so many patriotic people, Peter, in this country who are extraordinarily competent, who love the country, who want to help us. And as you know, A players hire A players and B players hire C players, right? And Nigel's one hell of an A player. Like he's the ultimate, we talk about founders, like Nigel's the ultimate political founder. So I'm very confident we'll be able to field hundreds of outstanding people to be MPs. I think the cabinet, we haven't had, I've actually thought a lot about why is it that cabinets in Britain, for decades now, not only are they incompetent or not great, they're
morons, let's be honest.
So, we have a £1.2 trillion a year annual budget, and most of the spending decisions are made by Rachel Reeves and Ed Miliband. Without being horrible, you could spend decades scouring the country to find 2 people less equipped, to make those decisions. Right?
I know, but it's so.
But okay, but go back to systems, right? So I'll tell you why. I think I've worked it out, right? I think I've worked it out. If you want to become the leader of one of the 2 old parties and therefore become a prime minister, you have to buy off powerful MPs around you with the highest offices in the land. So you're not doing who would be a great chancellor, who understands the economy, and who would be a great health secretary. And by the way, we haven't talked about Matt Hancock being health secretary during the greatest health emergency this country has ever seen since World War II.
Yeah.
Well, in my view, hundreds of thousands of people are dead as a result of decisions he made. And, if he wants to sue me for defamation, he can, because I think that's a true statement, right? Maybe more than that, right? It's just appalling. Well, why is that? It's because you have the incentive structure that's in place in these 2 old parties. To become the leader, you have to buy off people who are, competence doesn't come into it. It's just power maximizing, which is why, as ridiculously hard as it was always going to be to go from 5 MPs to north of 325, that is the only way in which, you see, every person other than the 5 we have now, and maybe, I think we'll win some parliamentary by-elections in the coming years, but almost all of the new class of MPs will have won as a result of, assuming we do what we want to do, the manifesto and the agenda and our belief system, right? I think what's really clear is if you ask people what reform stands for, most people can name 3 big things. I really do believe that. And what that means is that people are, again, the whole left and right thing, it's like, yeah, we're just going to relentlessly optimize for things that are interesting to the British people. And we're going to be bold and we're going to be transformative. And we're not just going to be stuck with the way things were done, encumbered with stuff from the past, which only a startup party can do. So if we do all of that, then I also think we'll be in a position. We've already got some incredible people, by the way, who are there, who some of whom are currently helping us in the background, whether it's helping us defeat the blob, because, we talk about policy, determining what the prescription needs to be to turn the country around is one thing. Persuading the patient, actually administering the medicine, as some people with good intentions found, they got unstuck. Some of those people are helping us behind the scenes. Not that they have all the answers, but they have some data, right, that's useful to us about how the blob operates. we have to also think about, as I said, how we take our economy into the 21st century and fit for the digital age. But yeah, I think you will be very pleasantly surprised, even in the coming weeks, about some of the people we're going to put in front of the British people in terms of people helping us with the task forces at local councils. It's actually probably the thing that I'm most confident about in terms of the many challenges we have, given that, as I said, I have preferential access to that information, given I'm chairman of the party.
All right, one final thing. It's definitely an open door. You're talking about the problems I recognise. You're talking about solving things in a way I think I would solve it if I was good enough to be in Parliament. And you're talking about real, genuine risks. And I remember Dale Vince the other day tweeting about millionaires leaving the country, and he said, good riddance. And I was thinking, hold on, that is brain dead. We need these people. We need wealth creators here. But... And also, I've watched this week, the Labour Party Twitter feed is all about Nigel. I mean, I see the fear in their eyes, but there are potential Labour voters, Lib Dem voters, Conservative voters who are confused about what reform and what they stand for and have potentially been ideologically gaslit against them. Well, like, what is your message for those people?
It's probably the same as it is for everyone, to be honest, which is that we just say things that we believe to be true. And it is objectively true that in order to look after the most vulnerable in a society, to have a welfare state that actually works as opposed to one that's just relentlessly taken advantage of, you do need people to pay tax into the system. And the nature of taxes, I think it's about the top 1% of income taxpayers, for example, pays a third of the income tax receipts. And the power law, I know from business, is extraordinarily, important. Yeah, the top 1% pay almost 30%, and I think that's. I see no reason for that to change. And what's interesting is I did a briefing for financial journalists around the policy, and we talked about more wide-ranging economic stuff. And the Telegraph, which I actually enjoy the Telegraph, it's a good publication, but they ran with the headline that reform says it will welcome back the super rich, or we will get the super rich back to the UK, something, right? As the headline. And I don't know whether that was sort of designed to sort of maybe be something that might turn off certain people. It's like, well, hold on, like
that's great.
It's like, yes, like if people are going to come here, why would you not want? Would you not rather have the super rich than the 1,000 people who came across here yesterday, right? Like, and most people understand that. In order for there to be a social contract, number one, there has to be fairness. I'm a big believer in social mobility. I wasn't born into money, and it's one reason I do this because the reason I do this, I'm so grateful for the opportunities this country gave my parents, and it's given to me. I think I'm a reasonably good example of social mobility and the opportunity this country can present people. And I worry that social mobility is being severely curtailed, and we're living in a place where a lot of people who can leave are leaving. What does that mean? It means that you leave a population that is deeply resentful and is starting to work less well, and increasingly so, and that's what we're seeing. So, look, should wealthy people pay tax? Of course. There is an amount of tax that people will be willing to pay and the amounts that they aren't. You take capital gains tax, for example. That's a power law tax, right?
Mm-hmm.
The majority of you've just seen Rachel Reeves increase the capital gains tax rate. What's happened? Absolute receipts to the exchequer have gone down. So look, the first tax break we will do, tax cut, is going to be eliminating income tax below £20,000. That helps people earning the least, obviously. But we make no apologies. If you're listening to this program and you're British and you're currently either in Dubai or in Monaco or in Singapore or in Italy or in Portugal or in the Cayman Islands, start to price a potential reform government in 2029. We want you back. We want you here creating jobs. You'll be enormously, enormously welcome here, and we welcome your patriotism.
Well, listen, I appreciate your time. I think we've done a couple of hours here, and I know it's a lot of time when you're very busy. But these longer interviews, unfiltered, unedited, I think they're really helpful to help people form decisions. So I appreciate your time. I wish you the best. Perhaps we'll do this again sometime. And look, good luck with everything you're doing. You're speaking my language. You're speaking the language of a lot of people in the country. So all the best.
Thanks for having me, Peter.